So the kind of aim of it really is that we give you a bit of an insight to the kind of stuff that we do. And we will also kind of talk about some of the techniques that we use in our work. And at the end, we'll also have a bit of information about the kind of stuff that we've got coming up in case you want to kind of follow up your interest with that. Okay, so we are B&G, that's Ben and Gerald, for a very simple, simple way. So B&G is a company that we set up about 18 months ago in April 2019. And one of the things that's really sort of fundamental to our work is the idea of story and storytelling. So this is what this session is about, is to introduce you to some of the basics of what we do and how we do it. And our kind of strapline is Your Story Starts Here. And in fact, Your Story Starts Here was the kind of title of the first workshop that we did to sort of try out and test out some of our ideas. And that was kind of working with a group of individual people who kind of wanted to sort of almost understand their own kind of personal mission. And then since then, we kind of expanded that work into looking at how we work with organizations. So almost like the organizational story or narrative. So, you know, how you communicate your organizational mission and use storytelling to do that. So this is just a bit of a background in the kind of ways that we work. We talk a bit more about that. So we talk about people being able to tell a better story about what they do. So in relationship to charities, for instance, just, you know, lots of charities do amazing work and they really steeped in the how to do that, but often may struggle a bit with communicating their impact and getting across getting that across to kind of funders or partners in a way that's kind of compelling and making sense. So it may be that you really have a very deep understanding of what you do and how it helps the people that are your kind of beneficiaries, but it can be then difficult to kind of translate an idea of that impact into a sort of story or a way of communicating that to other people. So the work that we do is through consultancy, coaching and workshops, and we also kind of create specific training programs for organizations to sort of help them with this. So we're going to talk a little bit about ourselves, but my background is in the performing arts. So I was a director and a producer in theatre, and I still do work in theatre and with choreographers and dancers. But how I met Gerald was through co-founding an organisation called the Ministry of Stories, which is a writing and mentoring centre for young people in East London. And I'll talk a bit more about that a bit later on. But Gerald?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Now you get to hear my voice. And as you can tell, I'm not from these parts. I live in Edinburgh now, but I'm originally from the US, from New York City. But I've been working in nonprofit for 25 years as sort of very many roles, as a fundraiser by trade and a CEO and an executive director. And I used to run an organization in the States called 826 National, which was a creative writing and after school tutoring program that was cross country. And I'll talk a bit more about that, but that's how I met Ben, was the organization he started, and the organization I now run in Edinburgh are based on that model.
Thanks, Gerald. Okay, so yeah, just to kind of break it down a little bit about what we're going to do. So we thought that if we're talking to you about stories, that we should talk about our own stories, which I think it's the first time we've kind of done this in public. So this is quite an interesting moment for us. And we hope that they're interesting, but why we're telling you these stories is really for a kind of underlying reason about how they kind of articulate our values. So there is a relationship between us telling you our stories and about kind of what we do. And then we thought that we'd have a bit of a discussion with you about why you think our stories are important. And that can be in a creative sense, obviously, but it can be about how you communicate what you do and how you do it. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the techniques that we use with people to help them think about their stories or their organizational missions. And then, as I say, you can find out more about some of the stuff that we've got coming up. Actually, Gerald, before we do that, do you want to talk about why? Do you remember the thing about the 4 session?
Yeah. So
this is where one of those kind of moments where we realized that we might be able to help other people. So I'm going to hand over to Gerald to tell that.
Yes, we were in a session at the 4 Trust that was connecting nonprofit leaders with potential board members from the corporate sector. And they had asked Ben and I to give a talk about being a board member, what nonprofits look for in a board member, us both having experience, having had boards, and I've been on boards for a while. And they had unfortunately mislabeled us instead of as the speakers as people who might be looking to become potential board members. So we were sort of going around and people would come up to us and talk about being part of, whether or not we were interested in being boards. And at one point, a young woman from one organization comes to Ben and I and starts telling us about her organization. It's a very worthwhile organization, great work that they were doing, but she started to tell us about it and she began to talk and talk and talk and talk. And it was, I think it was about 10 minutes of her telling us all about her organization and what they do. Ben thinks it was more like 5. It felt like 10. And sort of towards the end, she suddenly stops and goes, well, are you two might be interested in becoming board members for our organization? Where we both then had to say, well, we're not, this is what we're doing. We're speaking, here's what it is. And she promptly turned around and walked away. And we were thinking, if she could have told her story in a much more succinct and interesting way, I might have actually, even though it was just there to be a speaker, I might have actually considered becoming a board member or introducing her to other board members. But instead of letting either of us engage in what they were doing or ask questions, she just spoke. And it turned out that the story was lost in just the sort of droning on about what the organization was doing. So it was, I think, at that point that we were both like, I think we could provide some help here to people as they work through how do you tell your story better, your nonprofit story better, your organizational story better.
And it wasn't as if she didn't know her stuff. I mean, she had an extraordinary mastery of all the detail of her organization. She had all the facts to hand, and that was amazing. But it was like a sort of rehearsed kind of patter that didn't allow any kind of conversation or dialogue with her about what that organization did. Okay, so I'm gonna hand over you to you now
to continue. So I like this slide. That's a very long time ago. But as I said, I grew up in New York City. I've been in the charity sector for a long time. Working as a fundraiser, as an executive director, as a program director. I, at one point, was working in a nonprofit and decided that I wanted to indulge my creative side. I was a film major at university at the beginning, and so decided to go back and get a master's degree in creative writing. And actually, that wound up helping me a great deal in fundraising because it allowed me to use my story writing skills and storytelling skills to help raise funds for organizations. And to help them tell their stories about what they were doing and how they do it. I think if you write a good grant proposal, it's a lot like telling the story of your organization and telling the story about your program and the story of who you're supporting and what you do. So if you have an opportunity to take any writing classes or even these workshops, it's a really good opportunity to really use that skill. And I think we all have stories to tell about ourselves. And so I always like to start this when I give presentations of me to sort of talk about where I came from and where I started. But I worked in the nonprofit sector for a while, and I became the CEO of 826 National in about 2010, which was my first, and it's a national organization. They have 8 chapters across the country. I, never been a national director before. I came on board and had the opportunity to just sort of like learn by doing about how you grow and make an organization cohesive and I'll talk a bit about a couple of things that I'm proud of that work, because I think if you've ever worked in a national organization, one of my staff members told me once that I have taken it with me for a long time. So, everyone's their own special snowflake. So everyone believes what they're doing is so different from everyone else's, where in essence, you're all doing the same work, but where you're doing it is different, and things about what you're doing and how you might implement are different. And I think it's sort of telling that there's the base story of the work you do and then how you do what you do. So in terms of a national organization, it was really interesting to be able to hone a national story about an organization and then be able to then use that story for individual cities that we worked in. But could you go to the next slide, Ben? One of the things around story that I think was really important and that we did, and one of the projects I'm most proud of, was I was in a meeting with a few corporations and a lot of big people. It was sort of the Clinton Global Initiative, and I was in this meeting, and somehow I wound up in the STEM workshop, and the organization I was running was a creative writing organization, but I had no idea why I was sitting in the meeting. And finally, one of the corporate social responsibility heads came up to me from Time Warner Cable, and she knew of our organization, she knew what we were doing, but she was like, "Why are you here?" And I looked and said, "I actually don't know why I'm here." But I said, "It's interesting that everyone's talking about STEM, but no one's talking about the need for creativity and the need for writing within teaching kids about science and teaching them about technology, right? If you need writing to be able to write your theorem, right? If you're going to create a program, coding, it's all writing still. So how are we combining the two to help kids understand the importance of writing, but how that fits in an interdisciplinary way with what they're doing?" And so from that one meeting, we began this relationship that wound up, I think, over several years and several $100,000 of building this book that is now sort of sold on Amazon. I think there's a couple of cities in China where this book is actually used in their school systems. But it was about creating and joining STEM lessons with creative writing. And I just thought that was an amazing way to use the process of storytelling. One of the lessons in here is called STEM and the Zombie Apocalypse. And it uses for young people zombies, which they love. In the US, they love them. I think they love them everywhere. But how sort of you can use science and storytelling from the zombie apocalypse. And they learned about disease vectors and a lot of things that are actually very important now in terms of the pandemic we're living in. So that was really interesting. Next slide, Ben.
Oh, how do I do that? Oh, that's clever.
I didn't actually know that was going to happen. That's crazy. This is the 826 National Network, the organization that I was the CEO of. There are actually two more centers now in New Orleans and in Minneapolis, and another that's about to open in Dallas since I left at the end of 2017. But one of the things I think that was really important in my role and in the work that I do, and I think has informed the work that Ben and I do with B&G, is about how do you develop an organization? How do you take the learning that you know from across to this network? And you had all of these great things going on across the network, and they were told very singularly, but they were never told to make a story that actually showed the impact. The 826 National Network works with about 40,000 young people a year, but everyone was telling their own singular story. So you'd have someone in San Francisco talking about the 500 kids they worked with, and another group in New York talking about the couple thousand kids they worked with, in Los Angeles the same way. But the power was in, and for us, as we were being noticed by many large-scale corporations and the government, was how do we tell this story together? How do we say that all of these different things are happening in these cities, but as a whole, we're affecting a massive change in the way young people are learning and the way young people are developing in terms of writing. And so took us, I would say, a number of years to get to a point where we were all on message together. and all speaking the same language. Ben knows some of my some of the times I'd be like, I can't believe this is happening right now. But we got to a really amazing point of getting the message and the information about what we were doing together. And towards the end, we actually had a public relations company, a branding company, come in and do a whole rewrite of everything we do. That it was great because at some point, no one questioned that this one tagline was going to be our tagline. And now I can't remember what the tagline was because it was so great. It was writing your own path forward. That the work we do helps young people write their own path forward. And to get that tagline and that information used by everyone as the part of their story that they can use was just, I think, is really important and is incredibly helpful in the work that we do. So, Ben, that's me. That's my story.
Oh, okay. So this is me. I don't have a cute picture of myself because I'm English. I just have this. Well, actually, I have the real thing, which is much better. So I have a really crappy slide of this book, but I actually have the real book. I forgot that I got it in my house here. And the reason that this is important to my story is that this is the first story that I ever wrote, or the first story that I ever completed, which was done when I was about 7 or 8 years old. And it's the story of a dog that goes on lots of explorations, and I couldn't think of the words for a dog that did that, so I just made one up. So it's called Both, the Explanational Dog. And I wrote it sometime just before Christmas, and I came up with this cunning plan, which was that I didn't really want to use any of my pocket money to buy a birthday present for my father. So I came up with this cunning wheeze to present him with the book, with the story, my handwritten sheets of paper, and to give it to him on his birthday. And because the kind of work that he did, he went away in the intervening 3 weeks, because my birthday is 2 days after Christmas, and he got it printed up into these 50 little booklets. So I don't know if you can kind of see this, but you can see that it was all kind of typeset, and he used my original illustrations, not very good with illustrations, and put them in the book. And so what he did was, I always had terrible Christmases, because 2 days after Christmas you get your birthday and your Christmas present together, which is not great. But he kind of made my birthday and Christmas, because he said, well, you've had all your presents except this one. And then he presented me with this brown paper parcel, and I unwrapped it, and there were these 50 little booklets in of my story. And I remember to this day the kind of absolute shock and disbelief. In fact, I was so shocked by it. The first thing I said was, I'm too young to be famous. But I look back on that moment now as being really, really fundamental to kind of what I then went on to do in my life, because something about the kind of validation of having this piece of writing, this story kind of given back to me and published was a hugely important moment. And it's kind of one of those kind of things that sort of acts as almost like your kind of anchor. And the interesting thing about it is that I kind of totally forgot about it until much later, but I'll come back to that. So after that, I went off and I went into theatre, as I say, still work in theatre. And some of the other jobs that I do is being a dramaturg, which is a very odd thing where you kind of work with theatre directors and also with choreographers to think about the story of the show that is being put on stage. So an example of that I'm doing at the moment is Romeo and Juliet. So I'm working with a choreographer on a new version of that play, but for dancers, which will probably not use any words at all. And it will also be updated. So my job is really to think about how that kind of works and think about how that kind of narrative works. So story's been very much part of, pretty much everything that I've done in my career. But about 10 years ago, I met somebody called Lucy, And we've been inspired by, the work of 826 in America, and we decided that we wanted to do something similar. So we created an organization called Ministry of Stories, which still exists in East London and has also kind of supported other projects around the UK to get going. And so it's a writing centre which involves usually about 300 people as volunteers who volunteer their time to come in and mentor children, usually one-to-one in a very sort of individualised process to kind of help them develop their writing skills and feel confident about writing. And we did, in the time that they were there, we did all kinds of writing. So we did songwriting, copywriting, speech writing. And there was one particular project I want to talk about, which was probably our most ambitious one. So we decided that we wanted to give the local children in the area the job of kind of imagining and realizing their own country through writing. So we had a kind of core group of probably about 100, and then a wider group of about 500 who came together to imagine what it would be like if they could run their own independent republic, which was called the Children's Republic of Shoreditch. And that was all done through writing. So they wrote a national anthem, they wrote the laws, they wrote letters to the Queen, the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister declaring independence, and we made sure that they all got replies, which was very important. If they write a letter, that they should get a reply to the letter. And they also created and designed and ran this, which was their own embassy building. And they came up with all their own activities to kind of that took place in the embassy. And it was a really important project for us because it really sort of put us in the position of what we wanted was that the ideas would come very much from the children themselves. So it was putting them in charge of what they were doing, which was a really important principle for us. So we didn't tell them what to write. We just said, this is the task and you come up with that. And our job as adults, as the volunteers and the staff members, is to sort of help them realize that. And this is us on the opening day. All the children got this passport, which they came up with the kind of constitution of the Children's Republic. I'm not sure if you can see that, but one of the things that I think is great about this stuff is if you respect and honor what children believe in, they actually surprise you very much in terms of what they come up with. So there's often this idea or a narrative about children, if you leave them in charge, it will turn out like Lord of the Flies and it will be chaos. But actually, I think if you can see the manifesto principles, fairness, trust, fun, love, education, savings, no one should be bullied, no more violence, and believing in clouds, that if most countries were run like that, we'd all probably be a lot better off. And this is a story which I hadn't seen before. So we wanted to try and be able to communicate what the impact of this work was. And obviously this was just one particular project. But this was a fairly typical story of a child that we worked with, which was he was sort of brought to us by his mum, whose first language was Turkish, and she didn't feel very confident about working with him at home on his kind of his reading and writing, and she was worried that he was kind of falling behind. So she'd heard about Ministry of Stories from other parents and decided that this was the place that she wanted him to go. And actually he wasn't really he was definitely quite reluctant to come in the first place, for lots of understandable reasons. But he became a member of the Secret Service of the Children's Republic. And this was a kind of light bulb moment for him when he realized that he could sort of help create this whole thing. It really became a point where he felt like, he sort of belonged and he felt validated. And he ended up going to number 10 Downing Street and running a kind of collaborative workshop in writing for a bunch of adults. And this is obviously a picture of him there. And it was around about then that when so a friend of mine was saying, what is it that you actually do? Because lots of the stuff trying to explain about that was quite difficult. and quite complicated. And I talked about this project and the kind of children, and my friend said to me, oh, it's exactly what your dad did for you when you were 8 years old, because he knew that story and I told him that story. And I had completely forgotten, it sounds ridiculous, but I had completely forgotten that there was any connection between my dad's publishing these stories and what I was doing for Ministry of Stories. And I'm kind of putting that out there because I think some of these things get very buried in us and they just kind of don't sort of get acknowledged, that actually, you know, these things that happen to us and these kind of core values that we have, we don't really articulate and we're not very conscious of. So one of the things that we try and do in our work is to try and sort of bring that out in other people, because everybody has these stories and they are there and they are fundamental to what we choose to do with our lives, and that they're very important to sort of articulate them. So we wanted now to engage you in a bit of conversation about why you think stories are important, and maybe specifically why are stories important in talking about how you communicate what you do in your work, or what, if you're running an organization or you're part of the organization, why they could be important in communicating that. So anybody like to volunteer some thoughts about that?
I think people remember stories more than anything else. It's sort of like they're engaging, so people will take away something, even if they don't remember the whole thing about your organization. They remember the story is more powerful than a spiel about the organization.
Yeah. So there, we kind of talk about it almost like packaged wisdom. So if we refer back to that experience of being talked at that event, I wasn't, this woman clearly knew her stuff, right? But it was very difficult for us to remember anything about what she said, because it wasn't kind of packaged up in a way that we could sort of engage with. Had she told a story about somebody that had benefited from her organization, I think that would have landed with us, would have felt a lot more compelling. So yeah, definitely.
Even about who she was and why she was part of
it. Exactly.
Passion was about joining. I think people sometimes leave that out about what their story is when they come to a nonprofit or when they come to their work. They tend to think, well, I just got to focus on the work. And sometimes the thing that will grab people, to your point, Liz, of the story, the thing that grabs people is why they come to the work, why they're interested, why they want to be a part of it.
Yeah, we worked with some people in the last group of workshops, didn't we, who were actually beneficiaries of the organization that they were now working for. And they completely ignored that. So that came out during a session. So they sort of said, oh, but, I did these when I was a teenager. I came to this organization's workshops, or I worked with them. And we said, well, you need to say that, because that's like,
right. That's gold. That's organizational gold, I think, for most nonprofits, that you have someone that now works for you that actually is making sure other people have the same opportunities. And I think he said, well, that's not really important, don't you think? And we're both like, yeah.
Okay, why else are stories important, do we think? Or how?
I think for me, we've been doing a few grant applications, and there's lots of similar organisations doing similar work, but not with our audience. And so for me, telling a story explains why we're different, why we're special, and of course everybody's special, but why our story is important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. I think it's that you tend to be, right, nonprofit. I don't remember how many nonprofits they say are in the UK, but how do you stand out amongst nonprofits, especially if people are doing work similar to yours, or you get a lot of, every now and then. I'm running a nonprofit now in Edinburgh, and we get a lot of questions around, well, how are you different from this other organization? right? Or how do you, who's your largest competitor? And then how do you set yourself apart from that competitor, is a story about who's benefiting from your organization or what you do.
Great. Okay.
Ronnie has raised her hand.
Great. Thanks, Ronnie.
No, I was scratching my chin.
Oh.
I was like being really thoughtful and scratching my chin.
You have to speak now.
I speak. Well, I'll tell you why I believe in storytelling. I think for me, living in Portsmouth as a woman of colour, my agenda when I have my storytelling nights is always to bring a marginalised group and have them have a space where they can share their journey, and actually that really helps bring common ground. So I love how that brings people together. So I think for me, the most powerful storytelling night I ever did was with the British Red Cross women's group, and women talking about overcoming in their experience. And actually it helped some people not see them just as refugees and asylum seekers. They had like this whole other identity that needed to be respected and honoured. And I love that about storytelling.
Exactly. I think that to sort of the stories we don't hear, right? Yeah. And from the people we never hear from, because sometimes either they don't feel comfortable or that we should know. And sometimes we have to be the ones to stand up and say, okay, I'm going to share my story, and hopefully other people will see and will share their stories.
Yeah.
Excellent. Any other suggestions? Any other thoughts about it?
Yeah, I just think it's just a meaningful way of measuring that impact that you're making, and it just makes it more real and provides much more impact, because what we can spout on every day about what we do and how good we think we are, but it makes it more real to your readers and the people who you're trying to get support from. It just makes it more real when they can see for themselves the improvements you're making to someone's lives.
Exactly. And I think sometimes with nonprofit work, we have a tendency to go, I would say, we go down the rabbit hole. So we start getting into the nitty gritty of the programs we do and what we do without talking about what the impact of it is, or what we're doing, or through a story we can then show it. Because I think we tend to think, well, everything we do is important, so you need to know everything. I think that was when we talked about the woman that we had met. She was like, I need to tell you everything we do because it's all important. And it's like, yeah, that's not at issue, but how do you engage me or a new person you want to join your board, right? To become passionate about your work is through not going on about everything, but about talking about the impact of it.
And it's actually completely impossible for you to talk about everything that you do in 5 minutes, but it is absolutely possible for you to talk about the impact of what you do in less time, actually. And that's kind of one of the things that we really fundamentally believe, that you can encapsulate the impact of what you do in a much more concise and compelling way. But if you try and say this is everything that we do, you get lost very easily. Okay, so I'm going to just...
Can I just say, we've got 2 people in the chat who've said, Suzanne says, stories allow us to express our ideas or experiences in engaging, passionate ways and encourage connection. And Claire has said, sorry, I'm losing my battle with my phone. Sorry, Claire. But her take on stories is it's how we learn and connect in general as humans. We want to hear stories. We remember narrative. Detail people can't deal with detail with anywhere. Sorry, Claire. Detail people can't deal with detail. I can't get it, sorry.
Okay, is she still there?
But she says she's loving the listening though.
Okay, all right. So really quickly, I was just going to kind of quickly go through why we think stories work. We talked about this idea of package wisdom. So, you know, they're in a really excellent way of kind of wrapping things up in a way that communicates and shares the kind of knowledge and the experience that you have with somebody else. And we talked about this, they create connection and empathy. So it's very difficult to kind of feel connection and empathy with statistics, even though they're really important. But if you have a story about how something has changed for a beneficiary, that really helps it connect with somebody about why the work that you're doing is important. And we think this is really important as well, because stories are inherently about change. So you are kind of creating an understanding or drawing a picture of to somebody else about how your organization is changing things for the better. So they are a really good way of talking about that and articulating that. Again, they give people an in. So generally at the end, a story will be, they'll have a moral or something at the end, which sort of says, this is the point of this story, and this is how you might be able to help, and how you might be able to become part of that narrative. And this is one of the things that we talk about in workshops, that there should always be that in your story, that there's a kind of call to action at the end, a point that says this story is leading to you getting involved, you know, becoming a volunteer, giving money, you know, doing other things that kind of can help us with our mission. And this is really important as well. We think that if you can be part of, you can create a culture in an organization where people talk about the good work that they do, share stories with each other, they actually become part of it, almost like a sort of innovation engine. By sharing what works with each other, you can kind of go, okay, well, we heard the story of how that worked and how that did some good stuff, and maybe if we carry that on and we think of something new to build on that sort of story and that evidence, then we can develop kind of completely new projects or new ideas. And so it becomes a kind of a virtuous circle. So this is, we're not expecting you to do this now. This is, Anne has done this. So I kind of go back to this idea that we feel that you can, you know, summarize the impact of your organization in a very succinct kind of way. In a couple of the workshops, we give people 30 minutes to go off and think about a sort of situation where they might be presenting to a funder, or they might be presenting to a corporate partner. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to pitch your organization. So it's 30 minutes to write this, which is, I think it's actually 25 minutes in the workshop, but it's really interesting when you're under that sort of time pressure, how much you can come up with. And these questions are the ones that we use to kind of almost scaffold that for you. So we just say, spend 5 minutes in the 25 minutes that you have, just answering these questions as succinctly as you have. And that forms the basis of a 1 minute pitch that you then do. And obviously it's not a finished thing, but everybody in the workshop gets to do it if they want with each other. And it's really, what's been really interesting is how much people get out of hearing somebody pitch for an organization that's completely different to their own. So it sparks off interesting ideas for you. Once you hear how somebody chooses to articulate, talking about what their work or what their organization does, you can suddenly say, oh, okay, if I said that, or if I had an example of that, that would really help me. So go ahead, John.
I was going to say, and sometimes the person who's in the workshop with us isn't the organizational leader, because sometimes everyone in your organization needs to be able to tell the story and needs to be able to talk about what you do. So it's been interesting to have people who aren't necessarily the people who always are the people up front be able to sort of craft a story that they can then tell to their friends or out to, you know, when they're out talking to people by chance.
So if you look at these questions, they're kind of fundamentally drawing on the stuff that, you know, these key principles that we talked about, that, you know, talking about yourself is not necessarily a bad thing because it connects you with the mission of the organization, helps you articulate what the problem is that your organization or you're trying to solve in your work. You can highlight the change that you're trying to have. and what the kind of key elements, not all the activities, but the kind of key principles of what your program does that's going to make that change. You bring in the statistics, which are really important, because some people really likes to know that you know, well, how many people are you actually working with? You know, how many sessions are you doing? How many schools are you working with? And then this final bit is talking about your call to action. So you're saying to them, how could they be part of the change? How can you be part of the story? Any questions on that? We have got time for questions at the end, but if anybody's confused, no? Gerald, do you want to say?
Well, one of the things I want to say also is we talk about the good ideas, but also, and I think something that is important is to also sometimes share some of the times you failed, right? Especially, or sometimes times that things don't work, because then you're telling a story about what didn't work, other people can hear it and give you advice or give you guidance or help you think through what you're doing. So don't always think I'd limit the story. It has to be to something good that happens. I think there's a lot of talking now, and there's a lot of value in sort of presenting your failures, if you can, in a way to be able to get guidance on what to do better.
Great, thank you. Okay. So again, I'm not going to go into masses of detail on this. One of the things that people tend to do when they're thinking about organizations is think about problems or think about things that they don't have. So if we only had this amount of funding, we could do this, or if we had this number of people. And we've used this approach called appreciative inquiry in some of the work that we've done, which is much more kind of asset based. So it's much more a framework for thinking about what you actually do have. So the good stuff that you're doing, the things that you're really good at, that you've got in your team or you've got in your personal skill set, and building out from that. And this is a sort of iterative framework for thinking about that and working from your assets rather than your deficits. And we've used this, or I've used this in working with individuals. It's a slightly different thing when you're talking about an individual's personal sort of skills or experiences, but you can also do this with teams and with organizations, and it is a really powerful way of working. And then what comes out of the end of that, in a similar way to the exercise that we just showed you, is a kind of narrative or a kind of way of talking about the change that you want to have within your organization, where you want to head, that is really clear and is very accessible, and is kind of brings everybody together around a kind of process. So it's a kind of very positive tool for change. It's over to you, Gerald.
Yeah, so what we do, I guess, and how we do it, we focus on a few things. And one, coaching around helping individuals and even groups sort of get their stories clear, but also work through ideas, concepts, and things. I think Ben and I are both now coaching several different leaders just around not just their stories and what their organization is doing, but what their organizations do and how they lead and what they could do better. Our consultancy work is, our example is Historic England. We just finished a project for Historic England. They were trying to figure out if they should start offering digital or enter into the digital world of what they're doing in digital education. How can they use the assets that they already have and the data that they have to enhance heritage education? And so Ben and I, both having experience with putting together sort of digital platforms, helped them think through what they wanted to do and did a deep dive into sort of what the field was doing and what they could do. And so we do a lot of work around in that consultancy of like helping organizations think through different ideas, concepts, different projects that they're working on. And I think because we both have nonprofit backgrounds, we bring something that's different from a lot of other consultants because we've done the work, right? We both led organizations, we've been in the trenches, we've worked with people, we know how it is, right? We know how tough it is to run an organization, and we know the joys of running an organization. So that's, I think, is very important for a lot of people when they come to us, of knowing that we know what we're talking about. And then trainings and workshops that we're doing, and it says, as we met Anne through one of our workshops, we've been doing currently many workshops through the 4 Trust, And if you go to the next slide, Ben, I think, with our organizations, this is one, is this our impact workshop?
Yeah, this was our last impact workshop.
If you excuse the fact that my face, I'm not sure what I was thinking at the time. But otherwise, it was really good. It's a really good opportunity. One, I think they're small sessions. We don't meet with more than 15 people, but it's a chance for everybody. Sort of, I think what people have found important is that you're meeting with different people from, and what the online, I think, if anything has come out of this, it's allowing people from very different areas and very different backgrounds and all over the country to get together and to sort of experience the workshops together, and then to learn from each other and to hear from each other and talk through the different topics that we're talking about. So currently, next slide. We've got several workshops that we're working on that will actually start next week. One is we're doing a workshop around charity governance. I think one of the things that's come up a lot with nonprofits, and I think in just the world now, especially where we are, is how do you build a good board? How do you build a board that works for you? How do you work with your board chair? How is that, the importance of that trustee and CEO relationship? And how do you just grow your board to be the best that it can be and to support your organization? Telling your story with impact is about using your data and using what is your evaluation data to be able to tell your story. I think we tend to collect a lot of information, statistics, numbers, but how do we use all that to tell the stories of our organization and the impact that we're making? Building great corporate partnerships is just about how you start a corporate partnership, how to identify them, how to find them, how to manage them, and how to take care of them. And how that can just help your organization raise funds, but grow in partnerships within the community. And most of our organizations are about most of our workshops are about 3 hours long. And they're very hands-on. Usually for all of them, they're sort of a 30-minute time for you to go away and to think about and work on a project. So it's not all of us just talking all the time. It is definitely very interactive.
Okay. I think that's about it for today. I think you call it It's a Wrap or something, don't you?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a wrap.
It's a wrap. Thank you all for coming. It's lovely to see you. And yeah, I hope to see you all again in the very near future, telling your stories.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Great night.
Bye.